Welcome. Hello. Thank you for coming this morning. It's afternoon, evening. Where are we? Thank you for coming this morning. We appreciate your attendance. This promises to be a really interesting conversation. We had a great conversation last night looking at representational movie clips that are important and had an immense kind of like circulation power in the world and what those mean. And today we're going to be talking about the role of the critic and what that means and what that work involves and where that work might be going in the future. And so we're going to be doing this for probably about an hour and some change, hour and a half, talking casually. If you want to get up and go have some snacks to keep you fortified, please feel free to do that. My name is Angela Guayo. I'm the acting director of the Roger Ebert Center for Film Studies, and this is our panel on representations and their critics. Before we get started, we have someone who's going to introduce our panelists and moderate our panel today. But before we get started, I wanted to point out that there is an excellent exhibit happening right outside of this room, and the chair of the architecture department is going to tell you a little bit about it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm Catherine Anthony, and I've been on the faculty of the School of Architecture here for 40 years, hard to believe, right now, celebrating my 40th year here, and I'm a fan of Ebert Fest. Thank you so much, Angela, and I attended the event last night. It was wonderful, and I said 2 hours went by so fast. It was really great. I love the format and the films, and I've got to add to my list of things I want to see. So I briefly want to just mention to you that we have an exhibit right over here at the Ebert Center, if you go down the steps, and it's called From Backdrop to Stardom, How Movies Create Memorable Spaces. And it's a collection of over 60 curated artworks spanning a mix of architectural themes, film genres, directors, and eras. And it's the top projects curated over about 800 some projects that were done in my class over a decade. We picked the very best ones, and they're shown here in a series of galleries that talk about from finding your way well, you'll see galleries on architectural typologies, architectural elements, film directors, behind the scenes. There's a lot going on. One of my favorites is at the end where we asked people if Alfred Hitchcock resurfaced during the pandemic, what would things look like? And so the students were asked to do a collage based on that prompt and inspired by one of his films. That's one of the last ones that you'll see. So anyway, it's up here today. It was here for the Boneyard Arts Festival. It's going to be moved around the building later this afternoon, but right now it's all intact. So if you have time after the event is over, or if we have a little break, you might want to go check it out. So thank you so much.
Thank you. None of this would be possible without the legacy of Roger Ebert and the tireless efforts of Chaz Ebert to keep this legacy alive. Film criticism is an incredible asset to our culture. The circulation of meaning and images that help prompt discussion about some of our biggest problems and our biggest joys of living happen in the labor of film criticism. And so we are lucky enough to have Chaz Ebert here with us today. So I want to acknowledge that. And would you like to come up and say a few words?
Hi, good morning. I am thrilled to be here. First of all, we're here celebrating 25 years of the Ebert Fest Film Festival, and you are celebrating 40 years of architecture school. I love architecture. I'm going to go see the exhibit, and I hope I will actually encourage some of our film festival viewers to come, but we don't like them to leave the films too much. So I can't promise. One thing that I want to say, Angela, and for the Dean, Tracy Sulkin there, I am so happy to be working in partnership with you and to just see what you're going to create with the Ebert Center. Even though it's something that Roger and I wanted to begin with a partial endowment, other people helped, and it becomes its own thing. It's not ours, it's not mine, it's the university's. And so I want to see what they're going to create. I am so happy that one of our best friends, Michael Phillips, has been helping with some of the interns and students here at the university. He gives them a year-round experience. And people say, because he's at the Chicago Tribune, Roger was at the Chicago Sun-Times, people say, how can you have Michael Phillips? Why isn't Richard Roper? He's the Sun-Times person. Well, guess what? In this world, we cooperate. We have friends with people who are rivals at newspapers. I just wrote a book about compassion and empathy and getting the world together, and that's what we believe in. Also, he is actually one of the most brilliant film critics around, and we're very fortunate to have him. So that's how rivals get together and do things. Dana Stevens, I'm glad to see you back. I think it's been 11 years since you've been here at the film festival. Megan Cruz and Bobbi Miller. I'm really interested to listen because I need to know more about what more emerging people are doing, and you know, there are a lot of things that I need to learn about social media, about what you do is whatever. And so I'm glad to, and all of you, I'm just happy that you are here. I don't know why you're here, but I don't mean that. I don't mean that. What I mean is, I don't know what it is that you are hoping to get from today's session. I just know that I'm expecting something really brilliant, and I know that's going to happen. Thank you, Angela.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And one other person I have to introduce, this is our cousin, Roger's cousin, and my cousin Paige. She's a student here at the university, and as a kid, she used to come to Ebert Fest over the years, every year, and she always wanted to come, and Roger said he would be the happiest if she were on this campus. So Roger would be so happy to know that you're here, Paige. Thank you.
I'm sitting here dumbfounded because I don't think Paige is one of our Roger Ebert ambassadors, undergraduate ambassadors, so she's been working with us all semester. So I'm sitting here going, Paige, you never told me this. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, who will introduce our panelists and moderate this panel. Tanya Melendez is an Illinois Distinguished Fellow and a PhD student in the Communication Studies Department at the University of Illinois. Her research focuses on the rhetoric of television, especially surrounding issues of race and gender and policing. She has published pieces on television for Entertainment Weekly and Vox, and is strongly considering finding time for a Substack. Without further ado, Tanya Melendez.
You took my notes too.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, who I'm sure are tired of having to hear their own biographies said at them over and over and over again. But this is our chance to talk about how wonderful these people are. So let's start with Megan Cruz, who is Jay Stoobs on TikTok, and is the host, pop culture commentator, writer, and producer who has over 600,000 following across her social platforms. She was named by the New York Times as one of 8 TikTok stars redefining how movies are reviewed, and is the former co-host and executive producer of the popular Geeks of the Week podcast. She's a passionate advocate for marginalized voices, especially women in film, and her brand new podcast, The Broad Perspective, focuses on female trailblazers in the entertainment industry. Please welcome Megan. Seated next to her is Bobbi Miller, who is a culture critic and the host of the Afternoon Special podcast, where she pulls back the curtain on some of pop culture's most interesting niches and tries to make sense of it all. She creates edutaining pop culture content that uses history, analysis, and a dash of humor to highlight film, television, and more, contextualizing pop culture within our larger culture for a diverse and a young audience. Please welcome Bobbi. Since 2006, Michael Phillips has been the film critic at the Chicago Tribune. Previously, he was the theater critic for the Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the San Diego Union Tribune, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and the Dallas Times Herald. He started out as an arts editor and film critic for the Twin Cities Weekly City Pages, while serving as a film critic for Minnesota Public Radio. He also co-hosted the nationally syndicated TV series At the Movies, first opposite Richard Roeper and later A.O. Scott, and has introduced over 100 movies for Turner Classic Movies, which I am very familiar with your face from those introductions. Since 2015, Phillips has been the advisor and the mentor for the University of Illinois College of Media Roger Ebert Fellowship. Welcome, Michael. And our last panelist is Dana Stevens, who is the film critic at Slate and the co-host of the Slate Culture Gabfest, the magazine's weekly culture podcast. She has also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Book Forum. Her first book, Cameraman, Buster Keaton, The Dawn of Cinema, and the Invention of the 20th Century, came out in 2022 and is now in paperback. Welcome, Dana. I'm going to move back over here and not be behind that podium. And join y'all, because what we really want to do today is have a more informal conversation. So yes, I have questions, but let's let the conversation go where it will. But let's start with the foundational question. How did you get your start in film criticism?
All right, I'll start. I mean, I think all of us are probably going to say that we took a circuitous route, because there isn't really, especially now, but maybe ever, a straight route to becoming a culture critic. It's just such a small and narrowing field, right? So for me, I swerved over from academia. So like you, I was getting a PhD and eventually did get my PhD, not in film or anything related to film, but in comparative literature at UC Berkeley. So I thought I was going on that professorial track, and I'm sure as any of you who have been on that track know, it's very, even if it works out for the best, it can take years, right? So for several years, I was going for the 2 to 3 jobs in my field that existed each year, and almost getting them and not getting them. And in order to make a living during that time, I was doing lots of things, babysitting and temping at magazines, and the things that you do when you're sort of having placeholder, various placeholder jobs. And this was in 2002 that I'm talking about. And what was 2002 online? It was the kind of the dawn of the golden age of blogging, So, of course, I didn't think of it in that way at the time, because even the word blog, I still remember having to have it explained to me repeatedly what blog was and how it came from weblog, and thinking that's such an ugly word. Who's ever going to say that? But eventually, just because I wanted a place for my writing to go, and I felt, I had been studying and reading and writing for all those years, getting the degree, and suddenly had nowhere to write or think. I just started my own movie blog, and once a week I would write 1,000 words on a new movie. And because it was 2002 and there was a limited audience for such things, I managed to sort of gather a following, and yeah, I sort of ended up swerving into writing from that. I started to realize after a couple years of doing this blog on film that, not only was it more fulfilling creatively, but it was the place that, I was getting more kind of traction. And so around that time, maybe 2005, a TV writing job came up at Slate. I'm not really a TV person, much more of a film person, but it was sort of a way into journalism. So I started freelancing on TV for Slate. Eventually their film critic was poached by another magazine, and I moved into his job. So again, when I tell that story, I feel a little bit like I'm not trying to pull the ladder up behind me, but that's not really a great route. You don't want to spend almost a decade getting a PhD in something unrelated so that you can move into film criticism, but that's how it happened for me.
We'll get back to the idea of your PhD in comparative literature and how you use that.
If the microphones are working, can they use them? So
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Was no one able to hear any of that long rant that I just went on?
They're just for the Zoom. They don't actually.
Oh, they don't.
Oh, okay. I'll project more. I'm really sorry if y'all couldn't hear me.
Can you hear in the back? Wonderful. Okay. So we will project out. I'm very loud. That's not going to be a problem. But yes. But I do want to get back eventually to how you've used your PhD in comparative literature in your writing.
Okay,
So,
sure.
Control save. Michael?
I first have to say that as late as 2014, we had to convince the Tribune to not call it a weblog anymore. I mean, it's not really a hipster rag. But honestly, my career was sort of a weird quirk of luck and history. I went to school at the University of Minnesota, which had a tremendously good school paper that paid well. The editor made in 1980, the editor of that paper made $15,000 or $18,000 a year, which was like, I mean, a fine living, you know. Those of us who were arts editors and then wrote a little on the side, you know, more like $10,000 or $12,000 a year. You could live on that at 17. It was like, it's like it couldn't have happened, but it did. And at that time, there were, for a couple, 3 years there were 4 daily newspapers and 2 or 3 of everything, 2 weeklies, 2 or 3 monthlies. You had to be bad not to be able to get a little work as a freelancer. I mean, truly. And I was more about theater then, and a really good theater market, you know. I mean, I was, you know, interviewing like Jessica Tandy and Hume Croynan at the Guthrie when I was 17. I'd been driving for 1 year, you know. And just luck. And then luckily a place to just sort of be embarrassing a long time. I mean, when I think of the first time you review a film by a certain director, first time you ever review a film or a play by a famous playwright, or, you know, or Chekhov or Shakespeare, whatever. I mean, those are, you're writing at that age like a combination of people you admire because you don't have your own voice yet. And I don't like that advice. Find your voice. I think it's the least helpful, least specific advice you can give a writer. So I've been trying to, as a teacher, I'm totally avoiding your question about the resume, but I'm trying to find a better way to say find your voice, because it's the hardest thing to do. But anyway, from there, you know, got fluked onto the Weekly as the film critic. They needed an arts editor. 2 years later, I did that, and I did want to write about theater full time somewhere. I was doing movies and TV. Luckily, I had 2 specialties that saved me, because I by the time I had done theater for a few different papers, I was starting to dry out on that subject, and I had movies to go back to, you know, plausibly, and did. So that I did it, you know, thanks to the high school paper, thanks to again writing about movies a few times for the high school paper. What's up? Okay, Jaws, Taxi Driver, Star Wars, not a bad streak, you know, and you know, I mean, ridiculous. I mean, you know, the most naive review ever written of Taxi Driver at 15. You know, I couldn't even speak after that thing was over, you know. Speaking of tonight's film. But that's why I call it a quirk of history, and it's just that and this is truly, this is the serious part of this. I am fully aware of the white male privilege I enjoyed the whole way, just skating up. You know, every newsroom I entered, they looked around, they saw 90% white guys. Let's get one more, you know. As late as 2002, when you know, I got the theater job at Chicago, which was a big job. I was worried. Just had my, you know, son was just born. Really didn't want to be a stranger, and I turned the job down. I said, too much, you know, 70 hours a week, not going to do it. Luckily, every finalist turned him down for the same reason. And I started negotiating with a guy who had been passed over, like, we'll do a double act. We'll tell him it takes 2 of it, and we'll do it. And they bought it because, you know why? 2 middle-aged white guys. I mean, it's galling, you know, it really was. Even at the time, I thought, this is, you know, how long is this, you know? So there's so much luck and just the quirk of timing and a little skill, but mostly luck.
So I graduated college in 2020, so that was a really good time to do that. And I went to school for journalism at the University of Georgia, and I left school. I was like, I'm going to move to New York, I'm going to work in TV and do all these things, and then clearly that didn't happen. And so when I got the rug pulled out from under me and graduated college from my childhood bedroom, I was like, okay, I need to figure something out. And I was like, you know what, now is a good time to pivot to something different. And I found TikTok. I'd been on the platform for like just as a, lurker looking at videos and whatnot. But then I began to see this like kind of bubbling community of people talking about film and TV in the ways that I hadn't really seen before. And it was a very like internet way, I think, of approaching like talking about film and TV, but it was something that I like definitely wanted to be a part of. And so, when you're living with your parents and kid brother and you're all quarantining together and, your life is over, might as well start a TikTok, So I did that, I started it, and it just kind of took off from there. I think the very first video that like did anything, sizable was talking about the significance of like the food storytelling in the Breakfast Club. And I remember when that video started to do well, I told my mom, I was like, it's happening. And so then from there, it just kind of took off. And I think the one thing that was always prominent in my journalism tenure at UGA was like, this industry is not doing well. So you're gonna have to forge your own path. And especially being a woman of color, it was like, and then on top of that, if you do find an opportunity, it may not go to you. So if you wanna do this, you're gonna have to carve out your own thing. And I've definitely taken that throughout the rest of my career. So starting on TikTok and then kind of, finding the woes and troubles of that, but then branching out and creating my own opportunities. And I think it just kind of like one day I was just like, you know what? I think I'm a critic. And I just started calling myself a critic because there were no like real systems in place that I could get like accreditation from. So it was just kind of that thing where I had to like stand in that word. And then from there, it's just kind of, snowballed ever since.
Yeah, kind of similar situation for me. First of all, I'm not trying to look like a vampire or that I'm super cool. I have really watery eyes, and I would rather just not be openly weeping while I talk. So sorry for that. But no, I'm Megan, and I kind of similar. It's funny, Bobbi and I are 10 years apart, but we've talked a lot about how like similar our stories feel because I graduated in 2010. For the young people in the audience, that was like peak during the do we call it the Great Recession still? I feel like at the time we called it the Great Recession. I'm not a historian. But anyways, it was a very difficult time. I went to school for animation. I went to film school and I studied film. I had always been like a really big enthusiast about film and media. And then I decided that I really wanted to go into the industry, and I studied VFX, I studied animation. I loved it, but when I graduated, it was not a great time to find jobs. And it was just, I realized also that like my passion, so to speak, was like not really in like the technical side of things. Like people had just started using, like 3D animation was very popular. Getting a job in 2D animation seemed very unlikely. So I applied to a ton of different jobs. I worked a bunch of different places. I ended up having to work in all kinds of different industries over the next 10 years just because once things finally did level out, the job market is still kind of crazy. I think everybody's aware that, entry-level jobs are still, people with a lot of experience still tend to be going out for entry-level jobs. So it was one of those things where I just kind of assumed that I would find my way to something eventually. And then in 2020, when the pandemic hit, it was kind of like a reset for a lot of people, I think. It made me question like what I wanted to do. I had a really young child at the time. He was really little, so I wanted to make sure that he was safe. And I kind of like accidentally fell into TikTok. I started using the app as a user, and when I started putting content up on it like 6 months later, it was not with any intention at all. It was not with the intention of I'm gonna do this as a job. That seemed incredibly unrealistic to me in that moment. But when I did start doing it and when I did start like gaining a little bit of traction, I very quickly kind of had to assess the situation and realize what was happening. I think one of the reasons why, and obviously we'll get more into this later, but one of the reasons why I wanted to, do this today is because it became really quick, really fast, like the responsibility of having any kind of platform and having a voice in a space. And so I wanted to make sure that I was using it thoughtfully. It's obviously something that I've always cared about, and I loved being able to share my thoughts on media with people. And I still kind of struggle with what exactly to call myself, because I think that the role that I play is new. I like to categorize what I do as like a form of new media, because it's a lot to take on the role of creator and producer, but also like financier of what you do. It's creates a lot of financial freedom, being in a position that I'm in, but also like working with brands, advertisements. There's a lot of like ethical questions that you have to take very seriously. So I like to, be very upfront and clear with people, but this is something that I take very seriously. And I think the level of education, the more, and obviously I'm talking to a bunch of students, so you guys appreciate education, but I tell people all the time that it's not even necessarily academia, it's just being committed to like forever studying the thing that you are passionate about and want to talk about in whatever form that takes. So what I do now is I mainly create content. I have my own podcast. I've gotten to do several hosting opportunities, and I think like any journalist or journalist adjacent person, I think there's a good amount of research that goes into every project that you take on. But it's just been a wonderful learning experience. I've loved it. It's really incredible to get to like share things that I so passionately care about, and obviously film is something that connects with so many people. So it truly feels like a privilege, and I'm still learning as we go, but it's been a great time so far.
You all spoke, I think, a little bit in your answers about the way criticism has changed over the years, right? And the evolution of that word, and who calls themselves a critic. How do you the idea of accreditation, which it's interesting, Bobbi, that you said that, because I think that that's a question that more often comes up for women, more often comes up for women of color, the idea of, do I have enough expertise to do this kind of work? So I wonder if anybody wants to speak to the idea of what is the state of criticism now? What do you think of it as a genre of writing? What do you think is working? What do you think is broken? How do you feel about this identity that you have professionally? That's a really small question.
I mean, there's the personal question about it as, one's identity and identification as a career, but that can't help but be constantly impacted by the fact that culturally, economically, it's very imperiled right now. It really is disappearing so quickly. There's so few people in the country anymore, I think, who make their living off culture writing, not just film criticism, but any kind of writing about, some sort of cultural output. And we were talking about this last night at dinner. I mean, you really, to be a critic now, to be a writer on culture, you have to have some other income stream, pretty much, with the exception of a few people, maybe at big legacy magazines and newspapers. You either have to also be teaching, and I think all of us are, dealing with some combination of this. Also be teaching, or also I have a podcast. That's probably where most of my income comes from, because there's advertising on it, right? Or some kind of day job. There's a great culture critic, Chris Molanphy, who writes on pop music and pop charts for Slate, my magazine. And, he has a day job he has like a business job that he can't stand, so he never talks about it. But, he works in an office all day, basically, so that he can finance himself as a critic. And it's sad that we're at that place, and that's not where the resources of journalism are going. But they're pretty much not, and it's getting narrower and narrower.
I mean, I personally think that the word critic has itself become kind of muddied. I think the internet has created a place where, I think it's a term that applies to a lot of people now in ways that maybe it didn't before. Like, for example, Rotten Tomatoes. I think we're probably all too familiar with Rotten Tomatoes. I begrudgingly accept the role that Rotten Tomatoes plays in our society, but I overall think it's been like a net negative for the way that people receive art. But that's just like it as an entity. When you look at like the way it works, like YouTubers can get Rotten Tomatoes accreditations now. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I think that the internet has really, like Michael and Bobbi both mentioned, film criticism has historically been a little bit of an exclusionary field. So like the internet and allowing people to forge their own path, like Bobbi was mentioning, has really opened doors for a lot of people that aren't typically welcomed in these spaces. And that was one of the first things that drew me to like making content on an app like TikTok, was that it was a forum for film criticism that didn't look like any other space I'd ever seen. There was so much more diversity, so many more different kinds of people from so many more different kinds of walks of life getting to share their experiences on and their interpretations on media that felt like really cool. So it's like, it definitely has positives and negatives. I think it's great that the internet can in some ways be seen as a great equalizer, but I also think that because of that, anyone kind of can get a platform. And there are ways that people who happen to be very good marketers can sell themselves as an authority on something, maybe without having the personal code of ethics to make sure that like the intention or the history or education or sense of like responsibility is there behind it. So one of the things that I think is really important is as we like forge our path into like this new era of like what film criticism looks like and what form new media is going to take, is it's wonderful to see so many young people that are interested in that also want to have the knowledge behind it, because it's hard and you're not going to have a lot of control necessarily over what your competitors look like, and they might not play fair, they might not operate in the same way that you think someone should. And I think that the internet overall is a place where personal accountability and responsibility is like, it's an asset, but it also sometimes can hold you back. Like I think it's up to each individual to be accountable for their own actions, and you're never going to be able to control everyone else. So it's nice to, like, I don't mean to sound like too pessimistic. Like I think there's a lot of good people in the space still, but I think that it's imperative that people go into this with a sense of personal accountability, because journalism is kind of not in a very steady place right now. And if it's going to go towards like the individual taking all of this on, it's a big responsibility, is essentially what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so, okay. This is the thing where I have these cards in my head, and yeah. But you're talking then about the idea of everybody has access to the technology and can call themselves a critic, and we have to start thinking about that. As consumers of criticism, how do we gauge the credibility and the value of criticism that does, like the internet does, democratize everything, make everything look the same, and therefore have the same sort of credibility, right? If you're on TikTok and you're scrolling through, the algorithm is going to push more and more and more content creators that are on film to you as you follow people like you, right? So how do you think audiences discern criticism? Or is it more of just being attracted to critics who share your opinions?
I definitely think it's become the latter more than the former, especially on a platform like TikTok, and it exists on Twitter and things like that too, where a lot of the times these algorithms tend to flatten a lot of people, and they tend to flatten their analysis and personality. We were talking about it yesterday, but I found that in doing my work, like on an app like TikTok, if I ever try to veer into too much analysis or provide too much history, people don't tend to like engage with those videos as much as if I give like here's a very quick, easy like production, like history thing, like something very quick and fast. But I do think that there is this kind of like eternal battle from the consumer of like, there are people who definitely want to engage deeper and want to really get into the weeds of analysis and theory and history. But then at the same time, when you're actually faced with what that may look like, it's like, okay, I'm bored now. And it's that balance between like, being education and entertainment, and finding that middle ground. I think that becomes a bit cumbersome and a little bit difficult, because even as a producer of the content, I find like myself like wrestling with the question of how do I make this still interesting and entertaining, and how like what video clips am I going to use in my videos, and like how am I going to look? Like I have to think about all of these things, and then also think about, okay, what's my thesis, what's my argument, like what am I trying to say, ultimately do I want people to leave this video or podcast episode having learned. So it's a really tricky balance between the two.
Yeah.
I don't think criticism was really well served from the way it used to anoint critics with jobs in the old days, because it was this homogeneous lump of guy, mostly, and half of them were terrible. Half of them were just, no, he's done working out in sports. I mean, no joke. Move him up. We'll dump him over here in the arts section. And I mean, truly, that is not. Those days may kind of seem like a time of like careful vetting and like of slow progress, but every newspaper was a different ecosystem. Though I didn't work for a place that was truly intimidating in terms of like the education level of most of the staff until I got to the LA Times. The other ones was more just like a garden variety newspaper, like a lot of barely got BAs, some of them not even going to, all over the place, but in a very interesting variety, at least of backgrounds. And that's why I do take some heart against the employment odds right now from the variety of really vital critics today, because they're coming from all over the place.
Yeah.
And they are writing like they have something to say, and they're going to be, the two words you have to be no matter what kind of, are they clear about the kind of writer they're, and are they interesting? And what's beyond that? Okay, what's underneath that is, are they persuasive? Okay, in what ways? Well, that means that if you're really a persuasive critic, you're finding elements of a reporter in yourself to kind of simply describe and build your case and point out that this is what I'm talking about, and here we go, good, and here's why, and here's my feeling why this is a blight on society, or why this really made me laugh. That's reporting plus analysis, which equals criticism. So there's more of that going on now, or as much certainly as there was at any other time. And I love the way people get jumped up. Again, a little luck, a little timing, the rest of it. Why do certain things take off and launch you folks? Where you went. Why did Slate read your, pro bono
Right.
for yourself? Because why hire her? Because it's terrific. And that's good enough. And that's personal reader response. Mm-hmm. I like this. Why? Ask yourself why. Okay. As for the ones who kind of like peer and really weren't worth the heat, or they're sort of just like, they sort of like living, breathing clickbait. It's like the college actor who learns how to audition really well, and then you get them in rehearsal, and they don't have an idea in their head, and that writers can be that way too. You can find 5 pieces to show off, but you really ought to have, for your own future, be ready for 5, 10, 15 more, because that's,
Yeah, the only small thing I had to add, and that this really just kind of reflects off what Michael said, is I really want to believe in an idealistic way, to quote a classic movie, that if you build it, they will come, right? That if you do the work and create something worth reading, and just keep on returning to the well of, what do I have to say? What is this film giving me? How can I communicate that will find its way. And in spite of all the gloomy things we're saying about the state of media, that's happening even for, people who are just coming up, into the next generation of film critics now. So maybe it doesn't have to be the legacy media age or the golden age of blogging or something. Maybe we're always in an environment where if you build it, they will come.
So the idea maybe we're at a turning point in form, but this is the same turning point that we had when criticism got shorter or moved to television or ended up online, that this is an endless cycle of reformation of criticism, possibly?
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
I definitely think so. You were asking specifically if audiences, if we think that they, are trying to find critics who they align with versus, someone that they actually think is producing something interesting to say. And I think, like Bobbi said, there are definitely people, who just want you to, reaffirm their opinions because it helps their, sense of self. But I genuinely do think that, the whole reason why film criticism, blew up on apps like TikTok is because people are hungry for that kind of personal like introspective analysis on film again. I think that, you know, we had Rotten Tomatoes, which for a long time made criticism feel like it was not a personal endeavor, but something mathematical, like an algorithmic idea of proving like the quantitative value of a piece of art with a number. And I think for a long time people stopped reading reviews altogether. You could just check the Rotten Tomatoes score, and if it was above a certain number, you assumed it was good. You could go see it. But I think that audiences generally are hungry for like perspective. And I think that that's where like Bobbi and I have found audiences on apps like TikTok from people who want a personal connection to someone giving them like a critique now. And I think that definitely there are people who go towards like opinions that they just align with, but I think that there's like the build it and they will come analogy is very spot on, because I think that audiences really just want that kind of innovative like connection to film analysis again.
That's a perfect lead into my next question. Thank you. The essay "Critic is a Four-Letter Word" by Roger Ebert is a favorite of mine, and in that he says, "I believe a good critic is a teacher. He doesn't have the answers, but he can be an example of the process of finding your own answers." So if each of you could speak to how you believe you teach your audiences and how you lead them to answers about film.
I think I'm of the group the most like aggressively like taking the teacher approach. I don't tend to do a ton of like thing good, thing bad, but like more thing why or thing how. So I feel like a lot of my approach to my work is like, rather than doing the thing of like, is this thing good or is this thing bad, to really contextualize a lot of things. Because I think when you have context of time and place and production and all of those things, it gives you the full story for any given thing, and you can go into it approaching it maybe a different way. It doesn't necessarily make it better, it may make it worse, but just having that full scope and understanding, I think, has been one thing that I found to be really invaluable. And I think that's what I really loved about college, which me 5 years ago would be like, what? But one thing I really enjoyed, because I took film classes as well, was like, it was fun to watch the movies, but getting to really learn how that sausage was made was one of the best things. And it's how I think it's really made me a better media consumer when you know like the full kind of world around the thing. And so that's kind of the way that I want to approach my work.
Yeah, I think like I feel like the biggest thing that I teach my audience is how to disagree with someone and still respect their opinion. I mean, I've been labeled a contrarian by a lot of people. Like, people like really want to assume that I'm like aggressively instigating things. But one thing that I've like learned on my personal like journey through this is that if I feel differently about a piece of media than the majority of people, critics or audiences, doesn't matter to me. Like, I think it's important to like share why I feel that way and like really stand firm in my belief. I think that there's just been so much homogeny in the way that people like assess film these days. It just feels like there's a lot of sameness. People want to all agree that films are good or films are bad. And I think that that's especially harmful because of who has decided which films are good for so long and who's gotten the chance to make films. So like, if you look, like the IMDb Top 100 is like the bane of my existence because people are like, well, look at the best films in the world. And I'm like, well, the thing is, first of all, you look at the metrics of who uses IMDb. Then you also look at the fact that for a long time, women, people of color, they weren't getting even opportunities to make film. And when they did, they were being assessed by like largely white men, straight white men. And so it's like, it's a totally different thing releasing a film in 2024 when we have like this beautiful like diversity of film criticism, and not just in who's doing it, but in what format it's taking. But still, like the assumption is that a lot of times that these films are never going to push back on the greats, you know, like The Godfather and the Citizen Kane. It's like, yeah, those are wonderful films. But I think in addition to questioning like how they're wonderful, we should question like why we think they're wonderful. And what limitations there were in criticizing them at the time they came out. That has just become, now to bring up those criticisms, it feels like almost like an afterthought for a lot of people because they're just assumed to be so untouchable. And so like when I have a dissenting opinion, I think it's really important to say, hey, you know what? I actually realize that it's kind of a responsibility that sometimes it makes me really scared, honestly. I had a wonderful conversation with a critic about when Jennifer's Body came out and how she was a very, very young critic and she loved it. But then immediately all the negative reviews started coming out, and this was one of her first jobs. She was 18, so she told me that she was like kind of ashamed looking back that like her first line of her review was, I can't believe how much I liked this movie. Like it's actually kind of okay, like really apologizing for having that opinion. And I think that when you do have a voice in this space, especially a marginalized voice, and especially if you are like, have an intersectional identity, I think it's so important to say, these are my feelings and I'm not ashamed of them, because it's really hard sometimes to be the outlier. But when you're not, then there are no voices saying that. So with my platform, people often call me a contrarian, but I think that the best thing that I can teach my audience about film criticism is it's okay if your opinion is different than everybody else's. In fact, I would argue that's the best kind of art, that encourages different and personal reactions amongst people. But it's not necessarily easy. People don't like opinions that they don't agree with.
And you use a form of criticism where they'll let you know right away.
Immediately, yeah.
Yeah, the relationship between the audience and criticism is obviously radically different now, both online for people like Dana who get comments on your podcast
Right.
and on your reviews, versus comments that pop up immediately in your feed, versus do you get a lot of responses from film reviews at the Tribune? Do you get emails on those? Are people able to comment on those?
They took down the comments thing because it got immediately toxic and, legally difficult. And
Wise choice.
well, I mean, it's also just a matter of who's got the money. The New York Times, last I checked, had 36 full-time people. It sounds like an inflated figure, but I thought they had 36 full-time people monitoring comments.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
And we didn't have any, and we paid for it. The women especially paid for it within 6 months. 2 calls to the FBI.
So how does that change your relationship to your audience? That imaginary audience you sit down to write for. How does that change when you know they're gonna talk back?
I like it when I really do like the feedback. I think I have my ego is not, I don't know if it's healthy or unhealthy, but I feel like here's what I've said. I sort of like, it's their turn now, and whether or not you want to get, we talked about this last night, dragged into a thing where you really just, where they just want to call you names or something, that's another story. But I think, I don't know, I think, I don't like, the ivory tower image of the critic, it was never good. It never, and I worked around people like that, still do, who just don't get why anyone's questioning their authority or their opinion. And these are consistently the most mediocre writers. And because they don't live in the world. You feel like criticism should engage with the world you live in. I mean, a movie is like this great, we always use the funnel image in the workshops with the fellows, where the funnel, if the movie is this narrow thing, and then it can open up to everything. You should talk about when was it made, why was what's the the historical, political context. What is it making you think about that was clearly on the mind of the screenwriter or the director, whatever. Bring it all in and figure out a way to make that part of the review, so your review becomes what? Not formulaic. It doesn't read like some second-rate Reuters piece of wire. It feels like you want to feel like whatever you're writing or putting in a TikTok or any form is directly responding to the thing that must be said about that thing. And I got that advice from Roger about the terror of going on television in his place, which was terrifying enough. But he said, just think of the one thing you must say, because that's the only amount of time that Roper's going to give you to talk. And he was right, but what's truly the thing that must, and that's usually where you need to absolutely follow. That's the arrow pointing to where the review should go or where you should start. Then it won't read like the last 5 you wrote. But that's the thing. Formula is the enemy. We can all agree on that, right? I mean, I'm sure you the TikTok, there's no one formula for TikTok, but there are it's a format, and you got to try to find a way to, I don't know. I mean, these are just sort of like writing things that kind of plague me all the time, but it's usually just like, okay, what's on my mind on this thing? Why, if it's well made and sort of admirable in some ways that don't interest me, why am I still so angry about this film? I mean, if you ignore that feeling, then what the hell are you doing at the keyboard? That's what I think.
It's interesting because that actually reminds me of your review for Civil War.
Oh God, that was a tough one. Oh.
I think, Dana, you also that was a little tough. So I want to give Dana a chance to answer the previous question.
I can't remember what it was anymore.
I mean, just difficult.
I know,
Right?
but the relationship with the audience in your work.
Right. Well, I mean, I like to engage with the audience. I'm lucky that the Slate audience in general, we did get rid of the comment section, or if it's still there, I never read it, because they always get toxic. I think there is no comment section anymore in Slate. But back when Twitter was a relatively safe and normal place to post your movie reviews, I did enjoy engaging with people there. But I never got into fights. It was sort of one of my principles. Like, I will not get into a back and forth about movies or politics or anything else. I'll just tap out. That is a nice part about that kind of social media, right? You can engage as far as you want, and then, you leave. But I did like, hearing pushback about the content of reviews, right? If it's not personal and it's not just sort of, no, it isn't, yes, it is, then it's great to engage with listeners. And Slate has a lot of really smart readers that teach me things all the time. And the podcast, oh my God, the level of our listeners is amazing. We'll talk about something that we don't really know much about. And so, say we're talking about, I don't know, once we talked about a scandal in the chess world, and we were just sort of reading up on it. It was remember the chess cheating scandal from a couple of years ago? And so we're frantically trying to read up on that, and we got a chess player on to talk about it. Then we start getting letters from people, oh, well, I'm a grandmaster who judges tournaments every year, and here's, my thoughts about it. So your listeners also teach you, and, and your readers teach you all the time.
Before we leave audience, I saw a TikTok, Megan, that you did that was a response to a comment. So this is back to the Civil War conversation, because I've read 3 reviews from Civil War. You haven't touched it yet. I don't know if you're going to. Yeah. But you had a very positive review of the movie.
Yes.
And then the next video was responding to a comment directly. Can you talk about what spurs you to say, no, this needs further explanation, or something about what they said makes you go, I want to create a TikTok about this and continue this conversation?
So it's interesting. I was talking to Bobbi about this yesterday, because TikTok has changed a lot in the past 4 years. And who knows what the medium of choice is going to be in the next 5, 10, even 1 year. A new app could pop up with a totally different format. But I think this back and forth that you have, not just with people who follow your work, but also people who are going to make videos. Sometimes they won't even leave a comment; they'll make a full video. They'll stitch you, or they'll make a response, and it becomes very personal and very engaging very quickly. But I think there's a difference in obviously, Bobbi and I get immediate comments. I've gotten a lot. There's a difference between just very negative comments from people who have formed an opinion about you, and apps like TikTok, social media breeds this parasocial relationship already. And I try not to get too involved in that kind of thing. It's a kind of thing where when you have a public facing role of any kind, I feel like you have to accept that there are going to be people who just don't like you or consistently want to let you know that they don't like your opinions. But when I choose to respond to comments to keep conversations going, it's mainly because I find that the reason, in the case of the Civil War review, it was because it was a criticism that I was continuously seeing, not just from a single commenter, but from a lot of different sources. And so if it's a bigger topic that I feel like is shared by many people, then I think it's definitely worth addressing, to kind of continue my thoughts, continue my justification for what my personal reasons are, for the reasons why I think a film worked. And, I never want to say, well, I think, this other critic is wrong, or, you're wrong but I think that, there's a difference between stating your opinion as fact and presenting the strongest argument for your opinion possible. And sometimes that requires elaboration, especially especially when there are so many different opinions being kind of bandied about. So,
Yeah, Michael, your review was, it looked like it was difficult.
Thank you.
That you wrestled with that film as a
Well,
whole, and
yeah,
were
but-
wrestling with whether or not to tell us to go see it. And
I did.
And then eventually you're like, yeah, go see it.
No, I know. That was. I don't. Yeah, I'd love a do-over on that. I wouldn't come to a different. If it had a conclusion about like go or not go. I don't really like to think about the consumer aspect of it because that just messes you up. But and I hate the fact we use star ratings. But it's a Chicago tradition, so I'm stuck with it. But that film. Here was the most disheartening thing, and this is, I was answering somebody on Twitter about, actually it was a nice comment saying, yeah, it was a good review, you know, it was an interesting, I could kind of feel you wrestling pro and con, but it was, you know, the evidence was there that if you want to go, go. But my reply to the guy was like, thanks, yeah, it was a little flat dramatically, but in a little, you know, the rhythm's a little methodical in not helpful ways, but there's so many things in it that, you know, and I thought, well, those two sentences make sense to me. And a lot of that review I thought was like getting there, but I didn't quite find it. And you have to live, I think if you write a lot, or if you do a lot of TikToks, you have to make peace with with your success rate. You cannot, you know, I don't think it's baseball percentages, but it's close for me, where I don't really feel like I get everything I want said, and I like to feel like there's at least one aspect of the review or something in it that you wouldn't find anywhere else, just because I kind of, maybe the observation comes more freely and less strategically, and it just feels like, in the right way, informed, conversational, you know, boom. Roger was a genius at that. Informed, conversational, the least imitatable writer alive, Roger Ebert. You know, liquid style. And you can't really teach that. You just sort of get lucky. But, you know, it's not luck. It is preparing. If I do the right amount of research in advance and then forget it, then life's a lot better for the 3 hours I'm at the keyboard. So.
Your review of Civil War also wrestled with it a bit. And, you know, how did writing that review come across for you?
Yeah, that's a movie that tries to create, I think, ambivalence and tension in the viewer, right? It's deliberately trying to kind of frustrate your expectations. And I don't even know that it accomplishes everything it sets out to do. That was a very self-contradictory review. It was the kind, I don't know if anyone did say this, but it was the kind that a listener will write in after, or a reader will write in afterwards and say, great review, but I can't tell if you liked the movie, you know? And with some movies, I don't think that's a weakness in writing about it, that you don't come down on one side or another. You know, I think I used terms as contradictory as sort of like, this is an important movie of the moment, and parts of it are idiotic, you know?
Yes.
And especially with a movie that's trying to be of the moment in the way that movie is, both of those things, I think, can be true, you know?
It's so interesting because I read all three. I will tell you my interest in forming my own opinion increased.
Good.
Right? Because it was such three diverse opinions. And I think, obviously, the role of criticism is, obviously, I'm pro. But I think that one of the reasons I am so adamant about professional criticism is just that, right? How do you develop your own understanding of film by reading these dissenting views on film, right? And that leads me to a question specifically that comes out of an episode of Afternoon Special, which is great, by the way. You talked about, Bobbi, how Gen Z has been accused of having a lack of pop culture foundational knowledge. And in that episode, you argued the millennials on up had our taste curated for us, right? But Gen Z gets to curate their own taste. So they were raised at the end of the monoculture. So they didn't, watch old movies on TCM with their moms on the weekend. They weren't slaves to TBS rerunning The Breakfast Club, the censored version, right? So that sort of foundational understanding of film is gone. So I have a couple of questions for the whole panel and anyone who wants to speak on this. First, how do you think film taste is curated in 2024, particularly for younger people? And second, how do you as critics adapt to audiences that you cannot assume their knowledge base?
I think widely for younger people, I think their film and TV tastes are curated by like people that they think are cool. Like because a lot of the times I find like especially on Twitter, artist or something will mention like some movie that they referenced in like a music video, and I feel like a lot of people will be like, oh okay, that person likes this, let me go and check that out. I don't know if it's a ton of like internal introspection, like I just kind of like this thing and that's kind of guiding me. I think it's a lot of external, who I think is cool, and also like on TikTok, like there are people who will say like, oh, this particular, like I like Jay Susan, I know she likes this, and this, and so I'll go and watch that. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing per se, because I think it can give people a good starting point of learning what they like. But I do think there's a certain degree of it that people may only align their interests with people who they only think are cool and not be willing to kind of, look outside of that. So it's take it or leave it type thing. Yeah.
I think one thing I've noticed that caused me a little bit of concern about, I don't even want to say young people, I just want to say like modern, like social culture, the way people interact with each other, is I feel like there's been like an increasing lack of curiosity from a lot of people. And I really don't think that applies to just young people. I think that we live in an attention economy. We live in like so many of the spaces that we all exist in together are algorithmically curated instead of intentionally curated. And I think that like when we talk about like when I make a video about a movie that I absolutely love, if it's an older movie, the odds that video are going to take off are so slim. It's happened to me so many times where there's a film that I just like love so much and like it's not trending, there's nothing even, like maybe if there's an actor in it who's in like a popular new film, it's got a better chance. But half the time, if I'm like far less than half the time even, if I'm trying to recommend a film to people, at least on TikTok or on some internet platform, with a podcast or when you have a dedicated listenership, it's easier. But if I'm speaking to people who, a lot of whom don't follow me, algorithms are just going to push me out to people. The odds of me being able to actually convince someone to watch something, like I can see it in the numbers of how well a video does, are so slim. Like people want to be talking about trending topics. People want to talk about their things that their friends are talking about. And it's strange, the comparison of like me growing up and seeing movies replaying on HBO or TCM or whatever, because I think that like the happenstance of like finding something that you love felt a lot more random then to me, obviously someone who's not like I'm not like an old person, I'm not like a young person now, I don't know. But so like I think it's strange because so many people that I see now, like Netflix is gonna recommend to you. There are times when I know that Netflix has a show coming out and it's not even in the top, like I can't even find it, I have to search for it. And I think that, that top 10 list of what people are watching right now, like the Tiger King phenomenon, where it's like, I watched Tiger King because everyone was talking about it, and then I was like, why did I watch that? So I just think that like we live in this, I think essentially like this is a bigger conversation, but I think people are like yearning for connection, and I feel like people are so separated right now that there's this desire to be a part of a bigger conversation. And unfortunately, I think like a result of that is a lack of personal curiosity, because we're all seeking connection in a way that feels relatable to someone else. And there are obviously people who still, seek this out. You guys are all like actively seeking an education in this, which is wonderful, but overall trends, I worry that there's less curiosity in seeking out diverse media. So it is kind of a challenge to like get people to connect with something that isn't like, doesn't have Sydney Sweeney in it or isn't like a trending topic,
Well, no, the last thing you want is you don't want maybe if an entire generation or whatever has a foundational lack of knowledge and whatever, you don't want that to sort of default to, well, let's go back to the great books list, or or the same 17 films that we've already seen on the AFI list too often, because just like there's everything going on in the culture right now that gets the attention top 10%, and then there's everything under, and then there's the rest of the iceberg. You know, we have to find what is interesting that is not apparent, and figure out this has to be talked about. This is worth it, and nobody knows about this yet. History works the same way. You know, I mean, right behind the great books is every other book, you know, that wasn't a received great book. That is your great book equivalent, you know, one of them. And that's the kind of curiosity that goes every direction, and but you cannot fall for old models right now. You know, it's a place to start maybe if you haven't read Dickens or, you know, but I don't have any, that's why it's a perplexing stance to some people, but I don't have any beef with anybody who wants to throw out the great book list or go back to it now and then, because it's just, you know, we have to find what is not apparent and then write about it. That's what a critic can do. That's a great satisfaction of being, writing or talking about any film that not everybody knows about. You know, it must be talked about.
You know, this goes to something that Michael and I were discussing on the drive from Chicago yesterday. We drove out here, and we're talking about, you know, the dire state of cultural journalism and media right now. Just in terms of the sheer economics of it, right? And I was saying, I mean, this is sometimes heartening to me to think about anyone who writes about and cares about culture, or, you know, or who is helping to, I don't know, who works in libraries, anybody who is working to sort of preserve our cultural heritage, right, in some way, and to further, to get the word out there about, you know, things that we want to pass into the future cultural heritage. Is kind of like a monk in the Middle Ages, you know, copying out a manuscript while, like, the barbarians are at the gates, you know? I mean, there's a kind of nobility to, you know, the fact that there are still people who want to, you know, who want to talk about this stuff and write about it and pass it to the next generation. And maybe that's really self-aggrandizing, but that helps me keep going when I feel dire about the state of media.
How does that change the way you address audience, though? Like, in terms of, I can't count that they're going to get the Field of Dreams reference.
Right.
I can't count that a certain percentage of my audience is going to understand those types of connections. How much does that go back to the idea of having to build in some teaching in your writing? Or is that something that you're like, I only have so many column inches, or I only have so long to get people's attention? How do you gauge that as a critic?
Well, I mean, your impulse is the best, I think. You have to, if you start shaving off, it's censoring yourself, you know? I mean, if there's a certain, a critic has to be able to be ready for putting up with a lot of derision about an obsession with one aspect of a film. You know, I mean, in some cases there'll be either a performance or a shot design that is just kind of stunning and completely out of fashion now because it would be too expensive to rehearse or whatever. But it gives me, you know, and maybe that calls for a certain description or two that is not part of the language. That's where the writer comes in. You use it, and then before your editor or the reader has any, you just, you know, for example, and then oh, okay, I see it now, I understand it. You know, you don't throw the phrase out and leave people hanging with it. You have to. That's your moment, you know, and that's part of the, you know, the teaching graph that is making a point, and that those are hard to do because you have to be right. you have to know the stuff and know how to describe it to the newbies, you know. But you know, we're all newbies on so much, you know, and we just have to write our way through it.
I was just going to say quickly that the internet also offers a great tool for that, which is linking out, and that's something that my editor will often suggest. Like, say that I used that Field of Dreams quote, right? I mean, that one might be so well known he wouldn't do it, but sometimes I might throw in a quote from an old movie or some kind of reference to something, and he'll say, well, our average reader might not get this, so find a good page about it and link out to it, right? I mean, that's something that you can now do online that you weren't able to do for many years. So you're kind of embedding the teaching, and if somebody wants to go, if you build it, they will come. What's that? They can follow that.
That is true. And you get to link to the actual scene if you like.
Right, exactly.
Right? Like, not just something about it, but
Right.
the actual media itself, which is great. I want to switch a little bit to talking about some specific film questions. Can each of you share an example of a film that challenged your critical perspective or forced you to reevaluate your criteria for evaluation as a critic? Again, I understand that's a lot. But,
Good
yeah.
question.
You know, I would probably say Oppenheimer. actually. It was really hard for me to come out and say that like I didn't love Oppenheimer, because it was so universally beloved. And watching the film, like I think that there are a lot of technical aspects that I found very, very impressive. And it's a question for me of when a film doesn't land for me, it's a question for me of like trying to figure out why. That's really important. And it's especially difficult when I can pinpoint so many like technically like very well executed elements, because I don't want to just come out and be like, oh well, it's well made. I mean, I could make the same comparison with. This one was easier. Didn't really challenge me, but like Joker's another example for me where it was like, yes, it's scored beautifully, it's shot beautifully, there's a lot of technical elements that work, but I don't think the film came together well. Oppenheimer was a more difficult challenge for me because I think that it did grapple with a lot of questions that I thought were important. It just didn't go deep enough. It wasn't curious enough for my liking. And trying to articulate rather, like exactly how a film that I can agree is like, I'm not mad that it won awards. I think it's definitely deserving, and I think that like just the cultural relevance conversation is something that plays into like the Oscars also. So it's like I'm not gonna get down and dirty and be like, no, it didn't deserve any of that, which makes it kind of complicated for people. I think the conversation of like, do you think it's a bad movie or do you think it's is it like people try and ask all the time, is it your favorite or is it good? Like, do you have a differentiation between like, what's your favorite bad movie? Like, do you think a movie is well made or do you just like it? And I think that that's a very nebulous question that's kind of, again, been kind of shaped itself by the very strict regulations we have of like what's considered a good movie. So with a movie like Oppenheimer, it was just difficult for me because recognizing all the technical elements that are very successful and then trying to unpack what it is, why it didn't work for me and the way it worked for other people is like something that makes you kind of like self-analyze, at least for me.
I think I've been making practice of going back and watching a lot of movies that like I hadn't seen. Like I'm famously like people will bring up like a lot of movies and I'll be like, oh, I know of them and I just haven't seen them. So like this year was the first time I watched The Dark Knight, and I like that there was like a sound. I was like, oh, and it was very interesting from a critical perspective. Saying like, hey, I'm gonna watch The Dark Knight, and then getting to the end of it and being like, oh, I didn't like that. And it wasn't like it's the similar thing of like addressing how it performs technically, and it's shot beautifully, and Heath Ledger's performance is insane, and that was the best part of that movie to me. But then also reckoning with the historical perspective, how history has kind of like shined on The Dark Knight and the legacy that it leaves, and voicing that opinion in a different context than when it came out and against people who are really a big fan of it. I found that from a critical perspective, I had to be very careful with how I approached this, because I didn't want to, kill anyone's nostalgia dream of this movie, but I also was approaching it with no nostalgia whatsoever for it, and not, basically trying not to just like be a dick about it, but also trying to, approach it from a like perspective of here's what worked, here's what didn't, and I think that like doing an almost like atemporal review was a really fun exercise, because when you don't have that, like when you have a years later historical context for it, it allows for a different perspective, which I think was really fun.
Mm-hmm. I'm still thinking.
Okay, I'll do. Mine is atemporal too, and here I'm stirring the pot at our very table because just last night at dinner you guys were talking about loving this movie, but Promising Young Woman I wrote about 6 weeks after it came out, which is exactly the non-sweet spot for reviewing a big movie, right? And normally Slate would never run a review. It wasn't a review really, it was an essay because it was full of spoilers of the movie, but they would never run a review 6 weeks after the movie comes out. But I just hadn't gotten around to seeing that movie. I think someone else wrote on it for Slate, but it was really buzzed about and talked about. And so then I remember watching it on streaming and being so angry about it. I don't, and I admire things about it, and I think Emerald Fennell's a talented filmmaker. She herself is like a promising young woman. I can see her making a movie that I would love, and I didn't hate Saltburn, but I really did hate Promising Young Woman and felt strongly about it, so that I made the case to my editor, I need to write about this movie. And it was a challenge for many reasons. I mean, it was a challenge because I was trying to channel a bunch of inchoate feelings into a coherent argument, but also because I was sort of making the case of, why am I trashing a movie that everyone loved, 6 weeks after it came out? Like, why does this piece need to exist? So it ended up taking a really long time and a lot of rewrites, and coming out, I think, well, in the sense that, it expressed what I was trying to say and got a lot of traction for something that was running so late. And I remember that as a critical challenge, but also a critical opportunity. And I wish that I don't wish there were more movies I couldn't stand, but I wish there were more movies that, that made me feel that kind of urgency to write about them.
I know that piece. And was the first draft like just a polemic? Did you just get it off your chest?
Well, there was a big question about how much spoilage there would be, right? Like, it's hard to figure that out.
The ending is a big factor.
Right, and so
your feelings about it.
Right, so that's why I call it not a review but an essay, because it really was for people who have seen the movie, and so there wasn't a lot of sort of, it wasn't one of those judicious things of, I'll go through and talk about, the cinematography and the acting. Like, I did mention the technical craft part of the movie, but really it was about, rape culture and the ideology, that the movie is trying to expose, sometimes admirably and sometimes I think really incoherently. But yeah, there were a lot of drafts. I don't remember what the first one was like, but I just remember that my editor, God bless him, kept encouraging me to do it, even though it wasn't timely and it, was full of spoilers, and it just seemed to me like, I don't know who this is for, but I need to write it.
I had well, it's an advantage of seeing something at a festival and then writing kind of unapologetically a quick report on it, and then having time and usually a second viewing to see it when it's opening commercially, right? And that was the case with Joker, Todd Phillips' Joker, not related. I really, really had a terrible reaction to that. And I think what I wrote out of the festival was nobody who had seen it and even half liked it would have gone past the first graph, because it was a very dismissive, pissed off, expression. And, it didn't really hold, it did the job because I was, it was among other things I was kind of, but I did think consciously with the review, okay, it's going to be huge. I would like some people who love the movie to actually read what I have to not get thrown off the train immediately. And that's one of the few times I've sort of strategized about, like, build your points carefully. I have no idea if it holds up now. I haven't reread it in a long time, but that was the case of not the opinion changing, but sort of just the, make sure you're being really clear about the evidence you're providing about why, the tone and the whole vibe of that movie, what it actually plays out like, and why it, you think it's a, kind of an abdication of some sort of, every kind of failure, really. I mean, it's so. I don't know. Now, unfortunately, I got to reread it and see. Well, that one wasn't any better than the first one.
So, looking forward to the sequel?
Honestly, yes, because for me, odds are it'll be better, and B, I mean, I'm a total whore for musicals. So, although not enough to, I'm just, I don't like all musicals, but I mean, I love the form. It's a we'll see. But, hope springs occasional, as we say.
I wanted to ask a couple of specific questions to each of you, if you don't mind. Bobbi, you call it edutainment, right? Your work on your media, on your social media. Can you talk about that approach and why it works for you?
Yeah, I think for me, I make my work is for the me who was deep in film classes and journalism classes feeling completely inept. Knowing that I love this thing, knowing that I love movies, I love TV, I loved entertainment, but in like the world of academia, it has that really funny way of making you feel like you don't like the thing the right way. And so I approach a lot of my stuff with the entertaining bit of, like, making it fun and interesting and all that stuff, but also just like not to be so cliche, but like knowledge really is power. And I found that I began to feel much less inept when I learned a lot more and I saw a lot more and I watched everything and like really just had this really strong knowledge base. And I realized that a lot of the pushback that I tend to get on my stuff, it's people feeling kind of deeply insecure. And I think sometimes film can make you feel really insecure, especially if you haven't seen everything. Or if you haven't, you don't know all of this like large historical context for something. And so people strike from a sense of, or from a place of not knowing. And there's kind of like camaraderie and community, I think, in this, and everyone talks about the like anti-intellectual like movement and things like that. I think there's community there, and it's not because everyone's stupid, but I think it's just because it is, if you don't know something and someone else doesn't know something, you can, find community there versus like someone extending a hand saying, hey, it's okay if you don't know this thing yet. Let's learn it together. Like that's the approach that I like to take, because I know that there were a ton of other me's out there feeling that same way, and it was such a fun moment in my life when I began to feel really emboldened by film, because I felt like I finally had that knowledge base that I thought everyone else kind of inherently had.
Oh, that's you inherently created a form that you would have appreciated having.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. Dana, your weekly podcast includes 2 other cultural critics.
Right.
Stephen Metcalf and Julia Turner. How does that change the game for you critically when you are not just discussing your opinions on film, but debating them sometimes, right? And going back and forth and really digging into the weeds of those types of opinions. How does that change you as a critic?
Yeah, I mean, it's really great to have both things going on at once, because often, especially when it gets to Oscar season and the big movies are coming out, I know that I'm going to get 2 shots at them, probably in the order of, seeing the movie and writing about it, and then the week after or 2 weeks after talking about it on the podcast. So it's a chance to get a redo, like you were saying, right? You always want to get a do-over when you're rushing to get a review out by the time the movie opens. But yeah, 2 other voices completely changes it. Not necessarily in the sense that we're going to debate it and disagree and change each other's opinions, but conversation is just such a different format than writing, right? You're not really making a persuasive case as much as you're sharing an idea and having a different idea bounce back at you. So I really recommend, if possible, to get yourself a writing gig that is echoed by a podcasting gig, and they can interact. Also, we talk about more than movies, right? I was mentioning like the chess segment we did. We have 3 segments every week, and it usually will be a new movie, a relatively new TV show, and then a third topic of some kind, just sort of a trending story in culture. And so it forces you, I think I also love that it makes me keep up on things that I might not otherwise keep up on, which informs you as a critic, right? Because you know about, the gossip about chess or whatever the story of the week is, you're more aware of, what's bubbling up in the culture right then that might come up in your writing.
Oh, that makes sense. Michael, you have a particular kind of journalistic career that is likely on its way out.
I'm right behind him.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wondered what you would think for young critics just starting out now. What are the sort of qualities of your kind of career that you are both sad that they're not getting, but also thrilled that they're avoiding?
Oh, that's great. It's good questions.
Thank you.
I'm sad that more people didn't get the years where your success measurement was impossible. Where, other than, drunken absence, or, and every newsroom had them back then, or just failure to hit a deadline. No, if you were, especially if you were the theater critic in a, there was, what you wrote about was rarely attended by anybody else in your room, in the newsroom. And so you were just, you're the expert. So that, I suppose that does something for your ego, maybe, your sense of like ease of like, all right, I'll just trust my opinion and go. But to not measure how well it did online, because there was no online, to not measure, you can certainly get measurements of like, hey, this one kicked up a lot of letters, that came in 3 days later because it was letters, I mean, that was crazy. It just seems like, you know, like the middle of the 19th century or something. But that's too bad because it changed quickly, and then now it's obsessive. You know, to be able to know how many seconds they engage with your review online, you know, is not great.
Yeah.
But there's a lot I look at now that I think this is great. A lot of stuff I had to learn, and maybe again luck was a part of it. But I think people now know that they have to know a lot of skills. They cannot settle early for just sort of relaxing into one niche or career track or skill set, and you don't. That's the only way to hedge your bets against unemployment. I mean, to know a lot of things, because to be really useful in a pinch is going to work for you wherever you work. You know, hey, I'll try that, or hey, I've done that. Maybe you've done it once, but you don't have to tell them that. You know, that spirit is much stronger now because it has to be. But it also just makes you a better thinker, a better colleague, a better human being, and ultimately a better critic.
Thank you. Megan, you know, I have a question for you mostly about form.
Okay.
So TikToks are often green screened, right? You have a piece of the film, but you also do some explicitly very TikTok type formats. So for example, I saw you do a sort of get ready with me makeup, getting ready for the day while recommending, is it Chimera? La Chimera?
Oh, La Chimera.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you talk about the constraints and the creativity of TikTok and how that impacts you and how you make those types of choices?
Yeah, and I think it's actually like super important. I'm so glad you asked because the kind of content that I do is so different than what the vast majority of TikTok is. Mainly that I don't shut up. Like they say on my comments that she be yapping, and they're right. But like I'm a bit long-winded. It's very hard to keep people's attention. I think that like an overarching theme of this conversation has been about, you know, what film criticism is going to look like going forward. And while I think it's so important to have the foundational knowledge to bring with you into criticism, we unfortunately exist in a time when you also have to have other skills, like Michael was saying, and the ability to hold people's attention, the ability to like be a succinct and effective storyteller, and being able to engage with your audience is challenging, especially when, you know, we have to do these things very quickly. Like getting out a movie review on a deadline is hard enough. Trying to do it in a way that like immediately grabs people's attention, holds their attention, and is under ideally 3 minutes long, very difficult. Any tools that you can employ to help keep people looking at you, like obviously I don't want to have Subway surfers underneath my video, but whatever works, you know? I mean, like I think that, you know, doing things like multitasking, doing a get ready with me, embracing other elements of the format that you're using to kind of aid people from drifting can be really helpful. And I've had varied levels of success on it. I think I've been on the app long enough where my audience specifically knows what to expect from me, and that's wonderful. But like generally speaking, if you want to grow, if you want, like for movies like La Chimera, which I was really like, it's unfortunately released last year. I love Neon, but I don't know what they were doing with that release model. It's getting like no buzz, and it's one of the most beautiful films of recent years. So it's like, especially when like I was mentioning earlier, when I'm talking about a subject that I don't know how much the audience is going to be willing to come with me along for this, it's helpful to kind of try to find other avenues. And you've really got to figure out what works for you, because it's going to be different for everybody. But if you have a specific set of skills or strengths or things that you think you could employ, I mean, I definitely say it's worth throwing a lot of stuff at the wall. I think bringing a strong foundation of knowledge and expertise is fantastic, and then trying to find a way that you can stand out and you can hold people's attention is like really vital going forward.
About how long?
I'm here for a small message break-in commercial, I guess. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I want to let you know, we probably should move to audience questions at this point. And then I would like to invite you into our Sunset Studio in about 20 minutes. We have shawarma joint, and if any of you are hungry and would like to have some food and eat with our critics and talk and stuff, we'll have that set up in about 30 minutes. But in the meantime, we can have questions from the audience.
Absolutely.
And do you need to break for a second?
Yep, right.
Okay.
All right. Questions?
Can I hop off, Megan, what you just said, experimenting with form and things like that? How much do you pay attention to metrics? Are you monitoring who's responding to what and how quickly a video takes off to know what works and what doesn't, or do you, I guess you kind of have to? This is your-
I mean, yeah, you kind of can't help but notice the metrics when you're not doing well. Unfortunately, there's so many like variables, and like operating on a platform like TikTok where like the algorithm is changing constantly can be frustrating, because you can have a format that has been working for you suddenly like fail to work. And I mean, that doesn't just apply to algorithm, that can apply to like trending things, like people's wants change. So it's definitely important to pay attention to metrics, but honestly, I try intentionally not to go into creating my content with an idea of this is what worked in the past, I'm going to try to meticulously duplicate exactly what I did before. Like, it's something you notice when you create content. Sometimes I had tried to create series in the past, like years ago. I'd be like, oh, I'm going to talk about this kind of movie, I'm going to do it in this kind of format, and the first video would get tons of attention. The very next video, I'd have 1,000 comments literally of people being like, give us more. The very next video does nothing. So it can be very frustrating when you try to specifically recreate like virality. But like, I think that what's consistently worked is when I talk about things that I'm passionate about, when I come in with a real point of view. And that's really what I think it all comes down to, is you can try to pander to an algorithm, you can try to pander to metrics, but essentially you've got to, if people will recognize if there's like genuine authenticity coming from them.
Same response?
Yeah, I definitely the same thing. I found that like audiences like things until they don't. For the first couple of years that I was on the platform, I would introduce myself like, hi, I'm Bobbi, I'm your friend who knows just a little bit too much about pop culture. I would say that in every single video, ad nauseum, to the point where people think my name is, hi, I'm Bobbi, I'm your friend who knows just a little bit too much about pop culture. They wouldn't even call me Bobbi. And eventually, when people were like, why do you do that? It bothers me, I skip past it. And at first I was just like, it's my thing, it's my brand. And then something clicked and I was like, I'm gonna stop doing that. You know, and it's not because anyone, like, not because they told me to or anything like that, but I just realized, like, I've got to adapt and I've got to change. You know, when I started my account, I was 21 and now I'm 25. You know, who I was at 21 is not the same person as who I am at 25. Thank God. And I realized that, like, I'm going to still be me. Bobbi is still going to, you know, show up, and I'm still going to talk about things in the way that I do, but you know, it's okay if my things adapt and change. And what I'm doing now is very different from what I was doing before, but it's still me at the core of it. And I think as long as that's there, as long as I'm staying true to myself, I am okay with kind of like changing form when it comes to stuff. But I try not to pay attention to when a video like doesn't do well, because then I fall into a depression spiral. But most of the time I'm like, as long as I'm having fun and the people I'm doing these videos are having fun, then it's all good.
Dana, how much information do you get from Slate?
About how my pieces do?
Yeah.
I could get more if I asked. I think I don't want to fall into that same spiral, you know? I mean, they have metrics, and I'm not on staff at Slate as part of it. I'm not an editorial, I'm just a contract writer, basically. Probably if I went to editorial meetings, I would be looking at how are the movie pieces doing, and, you know, oh, we need to get more. But I can see, though, from the kind of assignments I get, that things are getting more click-driven than they used to be. I was thinking about this in relation to La Chimera, and you know, to finding a small movie and trying to get a word about it out there. I was thinking of Totem, this Mexican movie from last year. I don't know if anyone saw it. Practically no one saw it. That was the problem. It was on my 10 best list. I absolutely loved it, and it also had, it might have been a Neon movie. It had that same dumb release model where it came out in 2023 for 1 week and no one saw it.
Yeah.
And then they released it but the reviews were all out.
Yeah.
And then it came out early this year, but there were no reviews. Anyway, it totally sank out of sight. And I was making the case to my editor, the same wonderful editor who, encourages me to do interesting things, but he wouldn't let me write on Totem. And the simple reason, I think, is that, it wouldn't have gotten enough clicks. And he was saying, I wish you could promote that movie, but you already put it on your 10 best list for 2023. Hopefully that got some eyeballs to it, but basically no. And that would not have been the case even 5 years ago, I think. If I'd felt passionately about a small foreign film, I could have said, I really want to write on this, and I could have done it. But Slate's resources are just being channeled in another direction right now.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
With the idea of commentary YouTube being so common nowadays, how do you guys talk about the viral movies like Salt, for example? I saw that everywhere. So how do you make your story different than what everybody else is saying, while also saying what you think about it?
I think with a film like Saltburn that reaches huge oversaturation, a lot of people the thing is a lot of people jump in, even people who don't have a specific niche of talking about media. It's a trending thing, so you're gonna get a ton of content on it. And I think that it's honestly, for me personally, it's less of a concern about worrying about how what I'm saying is gonna stand out, because you kind of just have the assumption that it's probably going to get views when you're talking about something. And I mean, for me specifically, I always feel like I try to, like Michael was saying about his Joker review, I almost have to kind of go the opposite way, where it's I have to kind of temper what I'm saying so that it's not as inflammatory. I feel like I'm so opinionated sometimes that I kind of have to ease people into what I'm saying. So with stuff that's really popular, the nature of the internet I have found is there's a lot of clicks to go around when something is really popular. But it is always a good thing to just make sure that you have a recognizable voice in everything that you do, I would say. And especially if you're considering the fact that it might get more eyeballs than usual, you might want to go into it with more care. Obviously, we try to put care into everything, but
I think for me, I tend to, it's that balance that you were talking about of how sometimes you don't always have a ton of time to cover something because things need to be timely, and especially on TikTok, it's a movie comes out on Friday, you need to have a video up on it the second you leave the theater.
Yeah.
So for me, I tend to kind of split up my things. So if there's something that comes out that's really popular, but I don't really know what my opinion is on it yet because I want to see it again, or I want to really chew on it and noodle on it and see if my thoughts on it change. I tend to cover something that doesn't really require my opinion out the gate. So I always like to talk about costume design. That's my favorite bit, and I think it's an easy way to talk about storytelling and really get into the weeds of the thing. Or in the case of something this wasn't a movie, but when Cowboy Carter came out, I'm not a music reviewer by any means, but a really cool thing that came from it was talking about the spaghetti western. And so I wanted to talk about that, and I made a video about it, and thank God it did well. But for me, I much rather, again, goes back to the thing of thing how or thing why versus thing good or thing bad.
Yeah.
It's just a lot more interesting to see how that sausage is made. And then some time later on, when it's more appropriate to do so, or I've really kind of staked my drew my line in the sand of how I feel about it, I'll come back and be hey, that movie was bad a couple months ago, actually. But it's less imperative for me to get my opinion out because I know that my opinion will inevitably change.
You might accidentally find yourself, if you rush to put an opinion about something that gets a lot of attention, you might accidentally find yourself being the girl that called Madame Web the worst movie ever made, and find yourself talking to Sony executives about it. So, maybe some caution.
Was that you?
No.
Theoretically, what did the Sony executives say?
Well, they might have said that I was right, but that's neither here nor there, because it's not always a positive.
I love it that the talent, it took the talent 20 minutes to start telling the truth on
Oh,
talk
literally.
shows. Yeah, it didn't work. Yeah. I think the one thing about those quick responses, which you have to do quicker than anybody, but what we've had to, there's been pressure sometimes, especially out of festivals, to do it, is you cannot, don't ever talk yourself out of a complicated mixed response, because half of what we see any given year, if you see 100 movies a year, let's just say, I mean, I see more, you may see less, 20, 25 of them really good, maybe. 25, 30, terrible. Not 2 beers on a couch, still not worth it, you know. That leaves 45, 50% somewhere in between inspiration and disaster. How often do you come out of a movie and say, or turn it off and say, it's okay? Pretty often, right? If you avoid a mixed review over and over and over and just start writing up or down because it's quicker and easier, you're a liar. You're intellectually dishonest, and you have to risk the frequent response of like, yes, but what did you know, should I go? Mm-hmm. But you know, all you can do, like what I tried with the Civil War reviews, is try to not just on the one hand on the other all the way, but just find some way to write it. You know, be clear, try to get clear about what works and what doesn't, you know, and then talk about it.
Yes.
So I used to write for the Daily Illini, and I created the Illini Recognizing. I pitched a video review series in the style of the A.O. Scott Critics Picks, kind of the objective, Ebert-esque kind of talking directly about the film objectively, and it didn't really take off. And a lot of discussion I had with the team was like, do you feel that from an amateur perspective, no like background, more personality, eccentric, like Chris Stuckman and Jeremy John's style of individualism, highly opinionated review centric, or do you think that's the only way, or do you think there is a market for that A.O. Scott, Ebert style of objective, more somber, prestige movie review?
I'm going to let somebody else take that, but I'm going to argue with you on the word objective. That word doesn't really apply to what. No, it doesn't to what you were trying to do or what we try to do. That word does not belong in criticism. We're after informed subjectivity. Informed subjectivity, not objectivity. You don't read an editorial on the editorial page for an objective, no opinion. Objective means no opinion. That's wrong. So it might be a slight adjustment, but we're taught often by even in upper higher ed, journalistic objectivity is a phrase we hear over and over and over. That does apply in some form, changing form, to non-opinion writing. But with the opinion game, it is, it's subjectivity, but the good ones lean on themselves to make sure it's informed subjectivity. And maybe that's a slight difference in how you approach it, the next version of that. But to that's your point, sorry, I just Bigfooted the whole thing. Try it again, but just don't, and make sure it looks, feels, and sounds like you, not some idea of objectivity, and yeah, that's it. Just lean in this. It's an opinion. It just has to be a good, well-argued one. So.
But I think I see what you're getting at in your question. That is a constant live question, I think, for anybody who's writing and talking about movies, which is, what is the place of the critic as, human being with a body and a history and an identity, right, in criticism? And how do you let yourself be the person, right? A man goes to see a movie and you are that man. I can't remember who said that. That's sort of a famous old critic, maybe James Agee or something like that. A man sits down to see a movie. It was a male critic who said this, of course, and the job of the critic is to be that man. I can't remember who said that, but it's a great quote. And funnily enough, it's a woman, Pauline Kael, I think, who changed criticism the most in that direction, who became like the actual body who's sitting in the theater, right, who has like a history and desires and a gender. But I think that's now, with the internet especially, we all are, that man, that woman, that person in our criticism. But for me, it's really important to not center myself, to not make the review about me. Like, it's great to have a personality and a voice and a history that you bring in, but I get really irritated by critics who are all about, I love this, I hate that. You know, like, I didn't come here to read about you. I'm trying to find out about the movie. So it's a hard balance. And it also changes movie to movie. You know, if there's a movie, like Promising Young Woman was for me, that causes a particular physical reaction and brings in your history in a different way, then maybe you show up more than you do in other reviews, right? But I do try to keep it I try, for example, and I can't remember who gave me this tip, I try to never start a review with I, you know, to have the very first letter be I. Unless it's a memoiristic personal essay, I don't want it to start off and center around me in that way. So I don't know if that helps, but I think that's a big question, and I think I, like you, do like to lean toward, you know, A.O. Scott was, when he was writing on movies, one of my favorite working critics, and, you know, Ebert obviously is, like, iconic in that way of, like, he is a person with a body and a history, but it's about the movie and not about him.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, well, I guess I've got two. So,
We have time for 2 more questions.
questions. Thank you so much. What a fascinating discussion last night, today. And so my 2 questions are totally different, so whichever one you want to do. One is, how would you compare film criticism with criticism of other types? For instance, food critic, restaurant critic, art critic, music critic, design critic. I come from the architecture school. We rely a lot on practitioners to come in and evaluate students' work. But we rarely talk about the nature of the criticism like you're doing right now. And it makes me think we need to have a forum like this in our School of Architecture. So one is, how would you compare your type of criticism, film criticism, and your roles with other types of critics? That's one question. Second question, totally unrelated, but you talked about relating to what's going on today, and I cannot help but think this melodrama that's going on with our former president and the trial that we've never seen before, and every single day something new happening. What kind of films do you think are going to be made about what's happening right now with Donald Trump and all of that? 2 totally different questions, but if you could take a shot at them, I'm just curious what you have to say.
Well, at least for the first question, in my last semester of college, I took a criticism class, and we read not just film criticism or anything like that, but we read like food reviews and like book reviews, music reviews, and everything, and we wrote from a lot of different perspectives. And so I think what's very interesting and different about film criticism, and in turn kind of like television criticism as well, from those other forms, is that I think in those other forms, well, I guess with film too, there feels like a more agreed upon standard of excellence, a bar that you're comparing against. Whereas in film, it really gets very artsy, loosey-goosey, it's jazz, you know, like where whatever critic is approaching or like how they approach it will inform like whatever it is that you're reading. One thing that I do think, and one thing that in that class was very prominent that we learned that kind of is a string throughout all types of criticism, is decentering ego. And that is one thing that tends to prevail, I think, with a lot of the work that we do. And literally, like in just talking about like trying to not minimize yourself, because it is your thoughts and feelings on things, but also like we're not the rock stars of this dynamic. We're not supposed to be. Ultimately, we are, you know, giving you all that you need to either engage or not engage with something. Like ultimately, the role that you're supposed to play or that call to action falls back on you. And so I think in film and in just any type of media criticism specifically, it's just finding that balance of decentering that ego. That is oftentimes a challenge, because you get really like, you feel like very emboldened, especially when you have an audience, doesn't matter really where it will live, when you know that people are waiting for your opinion on something.
Yeah.
And you feel very much like, oh my God, like they want to know what I think about this. But it really doesn't matter like what I personally, you know, whether I really, really like something or really, really don't. I'm not balancing whether it is good or whether it's bad. I'm meeting that thing where it's at and assessing like, did it hit whatever benchmarks it set for itself? Which I think is very interesting and kind of unique to a certain extent about film criticism.
Yeah, I think film criticism stands out to me because of the scale. I feel like I worked in restaurants for a long time. I feel like when you look at other kinds of criticism and like other metrics of judging excellence, it's a smaller community. I feel like because film is such a it's like the most prolific like art form of our time. Like I argue constantly that I think film is not only like an art form and form of cultural commentary, but like it's anthropological record to an extent, you know, like it comments what our society is like, and like it mirrors back at us things that like maybe we don't even realize at the time. And I think that with film criticism, everybody watches films, everybody loves films, everybody wants to talk about films. It's an art form that inspires like feeling, emotion, in a way that like you can look at a beautiful building and it can really genuinely move you, but a lot of people will just walk past it, you know? And so there are people that this is their passion, this is their love, this is something that they do that is excellent, that is respected by the people who know, but for a lot of people, it's not even in their knowledge set to consider it. With film, even people who don't study it love it and feel passionately about it. And it like, I think it's a hugely important like asset, I guess, in like preserving like times in history and what people were talking about and what was interesting to people. So like I do kind of feel like when I think about it, sometimes I feel like a very big like responsibility to make sure that like I'm doing it my critique of the thing is doing it a service regarding all of that, because I think that, you know, not to self-aggrandize too much, but like it does feel like film is just such a massively relatable part of being a human these days, and it feels like a big thing to kind of like be one of the people that helps people choose how to spend that time. That's like hugely meaningful for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's strange because the pandemic just focused our lives around screens so much more than before. At the same time, the industry kind of began falling apart more conspicuously. You know?
Yeah.
And so I still haven't sorted that out, what that's going to mean for the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's up in the air.
Can I answer the Trump representation second part of the question just briefly, because I feel like I'm talking about this, I'm crabbing at the TV screen about this all the time, is that, I mean, for one thing, we need a moment to digest, you know, it's still happening, like we don't even know what story we would be telling, but I really, really hope that these, you know, years since 2016 just don't get too quickly processed into that kind of game change. Remember that like TV movie about Sarah Palin? Like that style of just sort of dull like recreation of something that already happened. Like Julianne Moore looks so much like Sarah Palin, right? Like I don't want it to be Gary Oldman put on latex jowls and played Donald Trump. Like I really hope that somebody out there is going to process what happened in a more interesting way than just sort of, you know, recreating the trauma that we were all living through for some screen format. And I'm just thinking of, you know, really smart movies about politics that do weird, unexpected things, like The Death of Stalin, that Armando Iannucci movie, right, which somehow turned this really a lot of smart thinking about politics and authoritarianism and, you know, fascism really into black comedy. You know, maybe that wouldn't be the format. But I just hope there's filmmakers and TV creators out there that are looking at it in a more indirect way. You know, maybe it won't even be directly about the Trump administration, but we'll be turning it into some sort of allegory or whatever. But anyway, it's obviously a huge story to tell, but I hope somebody is sitting on it and digesting it to do something smart.
And let's end on that hopeful note. I want to thank our panelists so much for this conversation. It was incredible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Concludes our Ebert Symposium for 2024. I hope you enjoyed our panel today. We are now going to break for a lunch in the Sunset Studio over there. We have some shawarma joint buffet food. We welcome and invite you to come. We have plenty for everybody. We continue the conversation there. The critics will be there. If I could encourage you to attend some of the Ebert Fest events this week, we have a wonderful slate of events that are coming up, and it'll be great. Looking forward to tonight's opening film. It's going to be a rough one, but it's going to be a good one. But without further ado, if I could just ask you to pick up any kind of trash you have, and if you're over here, if you could put a chair back. Otherwise, please join us in the studio over there, and you might want to pick up a drink at this breakfast table before you head over there.
Thank you, Angela.